In the mid-1990s, as the personal computing world was rapidly shifting toward a new generation of processors, Motorola quietly released what would become the final high-performance chip in its legendary 68000 family. The Motorola 68060 was a marvel of engineering, a chip that pushed the classic CISC architecture to its absolute limit right at the moment the industry was abandoning that very philosophy. This is the story of the 68060, the systems that embraced it, the giants who walked away from it, and why it still holds a special place in computing history. To understand the 68060, you have to understand where Motorola was coming from. The 68040, released in 1990, had already integrated a floating point unit and memory management unit directly onto the chip, a big step up from the 68030. It was fast for its time and powered machines like the Commodore Amiga 4000 and various Apple Macintosh and Unix workstations. But by the early 1990s, competitors were moving toward superscalar designs that could execute multiple instructions per clock cycle. Motorola knew that simply increasing the clock speed of the 68040 design would not be enough to stay competitive, so engineers began work on a completely new internal architecture while keeping backward compatibility with the beloved 68000 instruction set. The 68060 was a radical departure under the hood, even though it could still run old 68000 code. It introduced a superscalar design, meaning it could dispatch 2 instructions per clock cycle instead of just 1. It added branch prediction, out-of-order completion in some execution stages, and a much deeper pipeline than the 68040. Motorola also improved the onboard floating point unit and cache systems, giving it roughly double the integer performance of a 68040 running at the same clock speed. To maintain compatibility, some of the more obscure and rarely used 68000 instructions were removed from hardware execution and instead emulated in software through exception handling, a clever compromise that kept the chip smaller and faster without breaking existing programs. The 68060 arrived into a brutal marketplace. Intel's Pentium, launched in 1993, was also superscalar and had the backing of an enormous ecosystem of software and manufacturing investment. Meanwhile, RISC chips like IBM and Motorola's own PowerPC, along with Sun's Spark and DEX Alpha, promised even greater performance by simplifying instruction sets and relying on compilers to do more of the heavy lifting. The 68060 could often match or beat the Pentium in integer performance per clock and it sipped less power, but it lacked the raw clock speed headroom of its rivals, and Motorola was already pouring most of its research investment into the PowerPC partnership with IBM and Apple. The 68060 was, in many ways, a brilliant chip born into a company that had already decided its future lay elsewhere. Perhaps no community anticipated the 68060 more than Amiga users. Commodore had used the 68030 and 68040 in its higher-end Amiga models, and many hoped the next flagship machine would ship with the 68060 at its heart. Unfortunately, Commodore collapsed into bankruptcy in 1994, right around the time the 68060 was becoming available, so no official factory Commodore Amiga ever shipped with one from the assembly line. Instead, the chip found its way into the Amiga world almost entirely through third-party accelerator cards, made by companies like Phase 5, which allowed dedicated enthusiasts to upgrade older Amiga 3000 and 4000 machines with dramatically improved performance years after Commodore itself was gone. Despite the shrinking market for 68K chips, the 68060 did find real homes. Embedded systems and industrial computing were major adopters, since the chip's efficiency and mature toolchain made it attractive for laser printers, medical devices, telecommunications equipment, and networking hardware where raw desktop performance mattered less than reliability and low power draw. Some Unix workstation makers who had long relied on Motorola's 68K line, such as certain models from companies producing VME bus industrial computers, also used the 68060 in specialized products. It was never going to be a mainstream desktop chip again, but in the embedded and industrial world, the 68060 quietly powered products for years, sometimes over a decade after its introduction. The bigger story might be who chose not to use the 68060. Apple, which had used the 68,000 family for the entire life of the classic Macintosh, made the pivotal decision to jump to the PowerPC architecture starting in 1994, meaning Apple's Power Macintosh line skipped the 68,060 entirely on its flagship products. Commodore, as we mentioned, disappeared before it could ship the chip in a real product. Sun Microsystems and Silicon Graphics had already moved to their own RISC architectures years earlier. Even Motorola's own future roadmap prioritized PowerPC development. In many ways, the 68,060 was the fastest and most refined chip in its family, arriving at the exact moment the entire industry consensus decided that classic CISC designs like it were yesterday's technology. The 68,060 represents one of the final serious efforts to prove that a complex instruction set architecture could still compete with the leaner, simpler philosophy of RISC chips. Its designers managed to squeeze superscalar execution, branch prediction, and a refined pipeline out of an instruction set that had been growing since 1979. It largely succeeded on a technical level, delivering excellent performance per clock and impressive efficiency. But the broader battle wasn't just about clever engineering, it was about ecosystems, investment, and momentum. Intel had the volume of the PC market behind it, and the RISC camp had the promise of a clean slate. The 68,060 proved CISC could still hang on, but it could not reverse the tide. Today, the Motorola 68,060 is remembered fondly by retro computing enthusiasts, particularly in the Amiga community where accelerator cards built around the chip are still prized collector's items. It stands as a symbol of what might have been a technically excellent processor that arrived just as its host company and its host architecture were being eclipsed by industry shifts largely outside its control. Motorola would go on to focus heavily on PowerPC and later embedded ARM licensing, effectively ending its own lineage of desktop-class 68K chips. Yet decades later, hobbyists still build new hardware around the 68,060, keeping its legacy of clever, efficient CISC engineering alive far longer than anyone at Motorola likely imagined back in 1994.